historical aspects of science, but we have also a very strong emphasis on aspects of science that are usually in most of your classes not much dealt with. And a little bit, the background to that, I would say, is a statement that Einstein made about science, that the end product, the final product of science, that what we teach you in lecture, is as dry as anything you could imagine. You know, nobody discusses when you go to a class the nature kind of like, or the chemical structure of DNA. But the way how we get to that dry, extremely kind of like concentrated extract of knowledge is one of the most passionate processes that humans engage. There are lots of human emotions involved, and we will talk about some of the ethical implications of these processes. And one of the goals that I'm at least trying to achieve in that class is that you're not only getting a little bit kind of like a feeling for these processes, but that I also try to kind of entice that you start thinking about some of these processes, because some of these things we're going to talk about will affect your lives. Because research has, of course, a direct implication. And if you take any kind of like modern scientific research, or even current things, like is, for example, forceful quarantine of people in the case of the coronavirus, is that ethical, justified, yes or no, are things that you will encounter in your life, basically. And so, for that reason, I hope that what you get out of the class at the end is that you look at some of these things in a kind of like a manner that you see how complex these topics are, and try to kind of like think about science a little bit in a wider sense than we actually normally do. Because most of the time when we talk about lecture notes or something, you get that straight up, and then that's all what there is. I mean, there is not much overthinking at home. Geez, I hope that the DNA structure is not wrong that they told me today. So that's the kind of thing. Two more practical things that I will talk kind of like probably right away. Oh, yeah, smart. I should put the driver into the computer. Otherwise nothing happens. So basically, the format will be that we have blocks of lectures. And these are kind of like partially a tradition, some are non-traditional lectures. So some of the lectures, for example, will provide movies or something that you can look at. So there will be other things than only lectures. And they will cover these historical, philosophical, and ethical aspects of science. So in generally they're centered around the major theme that we have in the department. So we've tried to assign people relatively to aspects that they are most familiar in their everyday work. And the assessment will be done through 4 blog posts. Now, I already posted among my lecture material on Mole. Sorry, my voice starts. On Mole, I posted the format of the blog post. So there's kind of like basically a template that you can use. There is still a little bit, I have to talk with the administration about the final date. So the way how that goes, the whole assessment, because that's always very important for students to be assessed. And I don't blame you. I mean, that's the whole gist of our educational system, that it's not necessarily my desire to assess anybody. But so what we will do is at the end of my first block, that means at the end of Friday next week, I will give you a topic for the first blog post. Then you have about a week to submit the blog post. The blog posts are not very long. And then I will grade the blog post and will provide them. This blog post will be just giving feedback about how to write the blog post and how they would be assessed. It's not part of the total assessment. And then that's followed by 3 blog posts by the 3 other lectures in the course, David Weiss, Professor Hornby, and Dr. Bergeron. And these blog posts will be then forming a portfolio. You can submit them at any time when you get the topic, or wait till the very end of the class. There will be a final date, which is then the submission date for all of these 3 blog posts, and then we will use that, the assessment of this blog post, for the grading of the exam. Is that kind of like clear? So there will be a little bit more information. I will put up something exactly about the final deadline on the Mole system. The reason is there was a little bit the switch of the format of the class, so the time point when the class I hold have shifted since we started kind of like the first planning about that. Okay, So assessment. Then there's one other aspect that I have to talk about very briefly, which is kind of like more administrative. You may be all aware that there is talk about strike action. And it's kind of like, it's unfortunate because it's the second year that this happened, because last year we had the same problem. So some of the faculty that are unionized will potentially go on strike. As of now, the strike is set to happen. There's still, of course, last-minute, last-ditch efforts to avert that. I do not know whether they are successful. Today, the head of our department, Professor William, sent out an email which lists actually the dates of the strike. Now, I cannot ask any of my colleagues whether they are actually unionized. I'm not allowed by law, so I cannot say, oh, if that person teaches on that day and there is a strike call for, they will not call. But I can tell you at least about me, I'm not unionized. This is partly probably because I worked before in America and there are virtually no unions in science. I've actually never heard to be anybody unionized in science in the United States where I worked before. So I will teach all my lectures, regardless whether there is a strike, but I cannot say that for the other people. So there may be, unfortunately, events where you may show up and there may be the lecturer not there. But it only happens on the days that are in that email of Professor Williamson. And if you feel it would be justified or better for you, then I will send another or put an information on the web page, on MOL basically, to list the dates again, if that's kind of as a reminder. But it will still not prevent that you may show up and there is nobody here. Okay, so with that further, today is kind of like a little bit an introduction in science, trying to start kind of like sorting out some aspects of science that we're normally not much talking about in class. And so I will talk today about these topics. Science as a profession. It's dear to my heart. It pays my bill. No, that's not the reason why I want to talk about it. But science, you will see, historically started not necessarily actually out as a profession. Okay? And there is historical reason why that is. I want to talk a little bit about the concept of discovery, which is in layman's term, when you talk with your uncle or aunt about something, then they will talk, oh, Graham Bell discovered XYZ on that day, basically. And we have this kind of like a general cultural notion that discoveries happen like this eureka moment, you know, sitting in the bathtub. I don't know whether anybody had such a moment, but anyway, so that's kind of like about the concept of discovery. How science actually is assessed, which is a bit odd kind of idea. You are everyday assessed, so that's kind of like something that you're very familiar with. But science, of course, in some way has to be assessed. You know, I mean, we have to know, is that sound what's published? You all know these everyday occurrences when you open the newspaper, you read something about, you know, that you should eat from now on a pound of broccoli to become 105 years old. And then you read some years later or some days only later that was all rubbish. Instead, you should drink 10 cups of coffee every day, and that thins your blood and does some miracle thing. And so the question is, how do you actually assess the value of science kind of of these things? How is it done? We'll talk a little bit about some aspect that scientists always are kind of like very, would like to talk about the financial side of research. Are there actually interests, financial, in science that may shape what is researched about and the outcome of research? You know, are there kind of like forces that may have nothing to do with the concept that we normally have, which would be the gathering of knowledge and enlightenment, what normally people would probably say is what science is about. And then we talk about something what I call the gatekeepers of science. That are basically a little bit like, now you have to help me out. What's the name of the highest court in Britain? In the United States, it's the Supreme Court. You guys don't call it here Supreme Court. You're all on Brits. Okay. What I mean with the gatekeeper is basically that you have institutions and processes that kind of like somehow control how science works. And so we'll talk a little bit briefly about what forces, what institutions are these actually in science that keep the process kind of running in the form of that. Okay. So the first thing is kind of like a little bit, and we start in history in the 17th century. It's one of the few pictures of, well, paintings actually in the National Gallery, Portrait Gallery in London. It's not clear whether it's actually authentic. That's Antony van Leeuwenhoek. You've all heard of him. He did this little device, which is actually not an original device, of the very first light microscope that ever was built. Now that doesn't look anything like a light microscope. It looks more like a thumb screw which somebody used to torture somebody. The reason why that is not an original is because we do not have an original actually from the master himself. He was very possessive about the technology that he had developed actually to design them. And so he kept that secret. While he was very prolific about publishing results that he gained with his microscopes, he was basically extremely possessive. The reason was that made him a star commodity, even in the 17th century. So he visited the royal courts to give demonstration with his light microscope. So for example, he went to Peter the Great and made demonstration of his light microscope basically at the time. Now, if you have never used that, I've never used any of these instruments, I've seen one in museums, it's not totally trivial actually to use them. You need a little bit of technique and training to do that. Now the reason why I bring Anton van Leeuwenhoek as a scientist up is that we would normally today probably call him a scientist, but he's of course the inventor of light microscopy and started something that has gone all the way till today. When you're down in the light microscope facility, I hope you had a chance during your study, or maybe you will get at the level 3 when you do practical work. If you see today, modern light microscopes are more than £500,000 expensive, very large equipment. That was how it started, very nimble and humble. Now the reason why I bring him up as an example is that if you would have asked him historically whether he was a scientist, he would have looked at you in a very weird way. And I will come a little bit why he would have looked in a weird way. He had actually a number of jobs. He started out teaching and were taught as a bookkeeper apprentice in a relative's bookshop. And then he became a cloth merchant. He had also what was very common in that age, in the golden age, he had a number of other jobs that he kept kind of as side jobs. Some of them are, as you see, land surveyor, the Weingorger of the city of Delft, and so on. So that's not really. And so you can kind of like wonder what in his life basically actually is the reason why Antonie van Leeuwenhoek became the father of light microscopy. I mean, there's not necessarily something that kind of like destined him. But there is an interesting link. Because he was a cloth merchant, one of the central tasks he actually was confronted was the judgment how good fabrics are, particularly silk fabric, which were, because of course the Netherlands at the time were a very important trading nation, were very important imported from Asia and distributed, and the quality and the price of cloth, particular silk or fabric, depended on the quality and the fineness of the threads that they use. So it was basically tasked with that idea, how can I actually judge how good these are? And if you've ever looked at silk threads, then you know that they are extremely fine. And so that was actually the impetus. So he played around with lenses in order to study and judge quality of clothes. And then from there on, he basically developed more things and devoted a lot of time in his life about that. Now, as I said, he would have not called himself at all a scientist. And he would have not been called by any of his contemporaries a scientist. So we come how actually the profession of science actually started here a little bit. Now, nonetheless, despite he was not a scientist in our conventional sense, his work concluded and included aspects that are very modern to us and that we still absolutely use. So the first one is, if you have ever the chance to look at some of his prolific drawings, and you would compare that to any modern light microscopic picture that you have in the textbook, you'll be stunned how precise actually the observation drawing was. So if you ever want to know something about precision of observation, then you can take a look at his work, or for example on Ramon Cajal's work about the neuron, the ganglia cells. Their drawings are extraordinary, and you can basically take them today in the textbook and they show exactly cells the way actually they look, which is basically something that even with potentially not as far advanced technological support, you can achieve extremely good results if you have time kind of like take impression and draw very fine. Now, so the first one was that, of course, these drawings are scientific data. And so data keeping and also sharing with other people is an aspect that's central to our understanding of science. Actually, you could say, like the saying of a tree that falls in the forest when nobody's around, does it make a sound? According to that statement, you can ask yourself, if you have made a breakthrough discovery and you do not communicate that, to anybody, has that discovery actually happened? Only the process of recording and disseminating basically makes, of course, a discovery knowledge in general form. So he also was a prolific writer of letters. So he basically, the question is, of course, if you're a cloth merchant, with whom would you exchange your scientific data? Maybe beside of keeping your own records kind of like in your desk. So in his case, he did that, what is very close to what we today do. Today we publish something, and if you have a finding, you would probably announce that on a meeting of here, the British Society of Microbiology. You would go to a meeting. Now at the time, this all didn't, of course, exist, but there was a body that was at that time point the most probably authoritative body about science at all, and that was the Royal Society in London. So he would write letters to London, and the vast majority of these letters, because he sent it to them, are actually in the archive, in the Tode archives of them. They are not only including a lot of these descriptions, that's why we know what he has actually seen, but they also contain these incredible drawings that he made. Now at the time, when he started communicating, was that then a process was kind of set in motion that is very similar as if you today, when you would communicate science in a way. There were of course people who were kind of questioning this whole thing. I mean, you have to imagine at the time, it's for us hard, to go back and imagine if something is. It's a little bit like always in science, like what we call in America, we call it Monday morning quarterbacking. I don't know whether I guess you probably don't use that term. I see that already. So that's kind of like the assessment that afterwards you're always smarter. So in hindsight, it's trivial to say, well, they should have discovered that, or of course clear, there were always signs that kind of like gave that away. But at the time, when people were not aware of that, this was a huge leap of faith. And at the time, of course, people had looked at water. I mean, water was sometimes turbid, but it wasn't, nobody's mind, for example, was that it's teeming of life. And you can imagine that when he first communicated that and said, okay, there was this incredible variety and multitude of twirling thing that people ridiculed him. There are very famous satirical comics about his stuff, about the quality actually of the water of the River Thames, which was at the time a source for drinking water in London. And people made, of course, fun about how that water of the Thames looks kind of like teeming of these very bizarre little animalcula that he had claimed that supposedly lived there. And people had, of course, disbelieved. So at the time, the Royal Society did something that's very similar to today's science process. They actually sent an expert, Sir Robert Gordon, to Amsterdam, to Delft, where Leeuwenhoek worked, and said, okay, you have to investigate that. Is that what this fellow is sending us in his letters, is that real, or is he making that up? We'll, by the way, talk about the making up process in science at one point in one of our later lectures, because that's also a phenomenon associated with science. We scientists don't talk about it. It's a little bit like in the family, when you don't talk about the uncle that's always drunken on family meetings. Fraud and fraudulent generation of data is an important aspect that shapes science in some ways. So they sent basically a commission, and this gentleman teamed up with some of the contemporaries of the city of Delft that were honorable citizens. None of them had, of course, a background of science, and they actually looked at these things in the demonstration, and he went back, Sir Gordon, and wrote a report that's today in the archives, that everything that kind of like was reported appeared to be really true, that this thing actually existed. So that was the start point of modern light microscopy. Now here are two examples of people again, now going a little bit forward, we're reaching the 19th century, that would have per se not told themselves as scientists. So Copernicus, that you all know, a Polish astronomer. We would today only remember him actually as an astronomer, but most people will know that actually his main job was that he was a canon at a church, and he did the astronomic stuff as a side and kind of like a moonlighting. He did that moonshining in the evening, kind of like when he had extra time basically on his hand. Nonetheless, again, he wrote reports about his findings. And so Darwin is the same. I mean, Darwin was mostly, actually for most of his life, he was a private citizen. So Darwin kind of like, his wife was Emma Wedgwood, and you may be all familiar about the Wedgwood. I mean, in England, that's Wedgwood porcelain. So it was one of the large companies, manufacturers of porcelain. So Darwin was lucky that he came himself out of a relatively financially well-off family background, but he had married extremely rich, and that afforded him basically that he didn't really have to have a job. And you will see that this is one of the important aspects actually that selected, among other things, who became scientists in historical terms. Because science was not really a profession, so why was it actually not a profession? Well, one of the odd things is that we use the term scientist all the time. If you would describe any probably of our faculty members, you would probably say, yeah, Professor John Rafferty, that's a scientist, or completely clear. So that's an expression that we use all day, and we kind of, everybody knows here what we're talking about. You know, somebody who devotes all his time basically on the pursuit of scientific discovery. But the term is actually not very old, surprisingly. So the term of scientist was coined before Darwin's birth. So I just said that Darwin didn't call himself actually a scientist during Darwin's lifetime. That's mid of the 19th century, or actually after Darwin's death. Anybody any idea? I should kind of like make these little things, yeah? After he died. So in a very election date. I mean, 19th century is not a lot. Exactly. So it was in the beginning, however, of the 19th century. No. And actually, by the way, whenever I kind of get asked, and I have to make this is a very important thing beyond this lecture, actually. If you are asked in science about a question, if we do that here, I'm not judging anybody, by the way. And I know that students are always reluctant to engage, kind of like if I ask a question or something. But it's important for me that when you start thinking also of becoming a scientist, you have to be, as a scientist, wrong. Okay? If you're always right as a scientist, then I think you pick too easy questions to work on. So the part of the science is that you guess, that you make statements, and that you have to kind of disprove them. So yeah, so interestingly, in 1833, the British philosopher, again, was staying a lot actually here in the UK, Whewell coined the term to actually separate science and philosophy. And if you read this, you may remember that Darwin studied, among other things, philosophy. So there was not a faculty of science at the university. You know, there was medicine, there was law, jurisprudencia, there was philosophy, and you all know that because you get at the end, the PhD is usually the doctor of philosophy that you get. You're not getting a doctor in science matters. It's quite interesting. So that kind of like is where actually the original thing was, because at the very beginning science was the philosophical interrogation of phenomena. That's kind of like where that comes from. So the term is surprisingly actually young. There was another aspect which is quite interesting. So I did postdoc at the Rockefeller University in New York. That's a private institution founded by the Rockefeller family, actually by the patriarch of all Rockefellers. There was a guy of Standard Oil fortune who was at this time the richest man in the world. As a result, that his granddaughter got sick with scarlet fever. And he had all the money in the world, and his granddaughter unfortunately died because nobody had any way of dealing and combating the disease. And so he got kind of like interested about the idea to change that. So he founded the Rockefeller University. When they set the university up, they hired scientists and said, everybody needs, however, a different job beside of scientists. Because at the time, they had the belief that you could impossibly fill a whole day of work doing science. Don't tell that anybody of the stressed out scientists in their building. But that was how people thought about that. There was the expectation there isn't that much actually to be discovered. So that has to obviously change very dramatically. So I'm moving on from, so scientist is something that's a very recent kind of like terminology that we use actually to describe. Now, however, of course, everybody basically knows that. Now, in layperson people, when we talk about discovery, we usually have the idea of a fixed opinion about a certain time point in time when people basically have made a discovery. Now, as an example here, a geographic thing is kind of who actually discovered North America, basically. Well, in the old days when I was in school, there was just, of course, always Christopher Columbus. You have a date kind of like, and there it's actually an event where you can attach a real date, basically, from his logbooks when he arrived what he thought was North America. You know that his first landing was not what we today call North America, was on one of the islands. But then later we found, of course, out that Leif Erikson already came a few hundred years before. So is he actually the discoverer? By the way, here on that nice map, it's one of the oldest maps that we have. Here is an island in Britain in an extremely detailed approach to draw it, but it has some kind of resemblance, at least, on the 10th century. You may not get much around and find your place. But so now we know, however, from archaeological things, that there were human settlements in North America much, much earlier. And there's a lot of debate, actually, when the first time of settlement occurred and the way how these settlers came out. So the so-called Clovis culture in New Mexico, we know from carbon dating, were at least 14,000 before BC already human settlement in that area. There are current ones in Idaho that are even older. There's some newer data which suggests that this could probably backdate to about 20,000 BC. And that's a flood date. So all that basically just tells you is it's not that easy, and sometimes as humans we pick an arbitrary event, like for example Columbus, because that's kind of like more in the history books recorded, and that becomes basically the surrogate for the idea when something happened. And that's not restricted to that. So a little bit moving forward, another British excellent example is the discovery of oxygen, the element oxygen. So one of the biggest conundrum in science at that time, in those days, was basically to understand what actually fills that space. There was a process, the term ether point, for whatever is here inside, but people didn't really have an understanding what that is. There's the ether theory. One of the events or observation that people used were candles burning process, because it became evident that when you basically have a confined space and you burn something, it will eventually extinguish because it seems to run out of something that's in the air. We of course know that's oxygen. What I just want to, not going too much into detail, is that Joseph Priestley did a lot of these experiments at the beginning. He's an incredible, interesting person. He came from super poor backgrounds. His father was a cobbler. And of course the expectation was, he had like, I think, a dozen siblings, that he becomes a cobbler again, because at that time point, education was a luxury. We don't appreciate it probably even that much today, because it's kind of like our expectation that you get educated. But at that time point, nobody would have wasted any penny on the education of somebody who came from low social rank, because the expectation was they would end up being again a cobbler or ending up having a very similar job. But he obviously piqued the interest of his teachers because he was extremely bright. By the age of 6, he had taught himself, with no formal training at the time, writing and reading, and was by the age, I think, of 8, fluent in 5 languages. Take that. It's complicated. I haven't managed more than 2.5 languages if I add my little Latin kind of like to it. So there is obviously an enormous intelligence in this guy, and so eventually he actually had been afforded that he worked in a laboratory that was provided by one of the dukes, I think, here in the Peak District. And that was where he did a lot of his actual work. Now he didn't basically came to the conclusion that oxygen exists. That's normally according to Lavoisier. But what I wanted to point out is that Lavoisier, again, the concept of oxygen was not one day, it was not a eureka moment. It was a whole period of basically over a year, where basically Lavoisier worked on the concept of dephlogisticated air. Now phlogiston was one of the coined components of air at the time that was part of this ether theory, what actually fills air. And so people tried to actually find phlogiston, what that is. And now know that's basically oxygen. And it took them some time to basically to get to that thing. The reason is when you're always with very difficult scientific discovery, you will see that it takes us time to actually get to that conclusion. There's a period, we will later talk about the philosophy also behind it, in the process, how that moves forward, where you know something is kind of like there, but you have not really gotten to the full conclusion what actually exists there. And so that takes time. Now some people may say, well, yes, Egbert, but that's the 18th century and people were not as educated, that's something of a past. And that's probably a valid thing, but let's look whether that's actually really true. Do we have now a process where we really kind of pinpoint all the discoveries? One of the examples is here the work of Stanley Prusiner, a professor at the University of San Francisco, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of prions. So that's the classical model of prions. You'll probably, I assume, hear something from Dr. Staniforth about that in much more detail. This is an active research area which still puzzles, and many aspects of that propagation of these prions are extremely puzzling. Particularly if we come from biochemistry, working with certain proteins, are very familiar with the concept that proteins have defined features and defined properties, because these prions kind of like behave in a very, very odd way. That was why it was very difficult actually to discover them. But if we look more precisely actually in the pathway that led to the concept of prions, you will see a familiarity that mirrors the process in oxygen discovery. So in 1966 already, it was there that people knew there were pathology that they tried to explain. And so then there was first suggested that this is actually a polysaccharide chemically. That's the cause for these brain diseases. In a year later, people had suggested that this is the protein-only hypothesis. And that was done after certain digesting process, so that you take an extract, you digest it with some enzyme, you treat them, and then you come to conclusion. The problem is, of course, that you don't know the chemical nature of the carbohydrate, so you may miss it, you may not digest it if you add some enzymes to it. So there's often a very ambiguous aspect to the experiment. And once you start in your level 3, and you work not any longer on lab projects like in a parent laboratory where you get the protocol, you know exactly if I put the two things together, there's this and this reaction following. If you work really in the laboratory, you will immediately understand that that's one of the first key experiences you will have, that things don't work out and that things look very ambiguous and that you get kind of like puzzled. Now, as a consolation, that happens still today to me after 20 years or more than 20 years doing experiments. I work in the laboratory. So in '82, a big jump forward. After this was coined, people started to search for that. You know, it was this race going on, who finds what protein actually is behind it. And so Prusiner announced that he had isolated the prion in this paper, published actually in 1982. However, they discovered 2 years later that the first protein that they had published was actually the wrong protein. So even a Nobel Prize winner can make a total mistake. And you all know, for example, in the race of the alpha helix, I think Professor Weiss will talk about that, that even the best of their field, Linus Pauling, made wrong assessment, for example, of the structure of DNA, was completely off. And again, that was fueled a lot by the race, who will win that. Linus Pauling had already 2 Nobel Prizes, one for non-scientific things. You may know that, I mean, he's the winner of the Nobel, he's one of the few people with 2 Nobel Prizes, one for his chemical work, and the other one was the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So in the DNA work, he was completely off, basically. Now, 1997, quite a long time later, Prusiner wins the Nobel Prize. If you look at this table, it looks like all settled. Oh, okay, all done. All done. So now we know it, that's it, done. Not quite so fast. There are still people who, because of that weird way how you have strain specificity of prions, hold out that maybe the cause of these prion-based diseases may be unknown viruses. Because a lot of the aspects, how they spread, how they have specificity, mirrors more than what we know from viruses. So there are people, I invited somebody, 15 years ago, to Hopkins, who's one of the members, he's a very respected retrovirologist who works for the NIH, and Bruce, the last name is escaping me right now. I have to fill that in the next time. And he claims, and there is a small group actually of people who still claim that this is actually the wrong explanation. So that hasn't been set up. Now, I'm not talking here about the thing, if you ever want to have fun as a scientist, you go to a flat Earth convention. I'm not talking about that kind of like being off. I mean, you will of course meet people who will claim, you know, that the sun is an illusion and things like that. But we're talking about serious scientists who have a big reputation in the name. Yeah, if you really want to have a laugh, kind of like it's weird what humans believe in a certain way. And how they will explain effects away once they get very, very actually adhere to facts, you know, to certain preferences or beliefs. That's our tendency. Once we get married to a certain belief, and this in science would be if you believe a certain hypothesis, you get so invested that it's extremely difficult for us actually to kind of like, sort things out. And that affects all kinds of life. I mean, that's in politics, you can see that in society. One of the weird things is, for example, now it's so long ago that we don't really remember, but you all know, you were probably too young kind of to really remember that. But before the year 2000 rolled around, there were a lot of people who believed that the Mayan calendar would actually predict correctly doom. And so the people, I mean, we're laughing about that, but there were people, of course, who sold all their possessions off and waited now for that doomsday to happen. Now, you, of course, ask yourself what happened then when 2000 came, rolled around, and the doom hadn't set in. And it's quite interesting what then happens, because you would think, okay, this is now the most obvious way how your belief system is challenged. And it's quite interesting. So a number of these people, the first thing what they did was like they recalculated the Mayan calendar and came up, okay, we were wrong, it's about a year or two first thought to be later. So good, okay, we just have to hang on and wait a little bit longer. That was one of the parts of the people. The other ones, there was a small section that gave basically up and saw that, okay, it was probably wrong and converted. But surprisingly, they're actually not the largest group of the people. A large group of people just would explain that basically away, the obvious kind of like not arrival of doom. And that's quite interesting, because some of these same kind of like way how we handle logically with things animates kind of like, if you believe, and I'm not here suggesting in one way or the other, whether, for example, Brexit will bring golden days ahead. Is that more kind of like wishful thinking of some glorious past that may be revived, or is that real? Is it really based on fact? So humans married themselves very often to things that then it may not occur. So in science, that's the same kind of. So I cannot tell you whether these people, the interesting part is if you're somebody who believes that this is all rubbish, then the question is kind of how do you handle that this is all kind of like there's a lot of, you will probably not get research money for your research. Whereas the funding agency will tell you, okay, that thing has been settled. You're the last holdout who obviously doesn't want to understand that this is all settled in stone. So that's a real problem for some of the people actually who work on this one. But there are, of course, cases where scientific evidence has eventually overturned ideas that were very, very long hold. I mean, I just spoke about this phlogiston theory. If you would have been in the 18th century and applying for money to do research, which wasn't an option at the time, or you convince a rich person to give you money, they would say, oh yeah, as long as you work on phlogiston, wonderful. And they're very important, of course, scientific discovery. Think about our long-term wish to convert not so noble materials into gold. The search for all these gold people led to a lot of very important chemical discoveries, actually, of elements in our understanding of chemistry. It never ended up to actually solve the problem of gold making, and a lot of research money was wasted in the process, of which people thought they would get even richer in that process. But that had a very positive side effect, basically. And there were very important people involved. For example, that Newton was extremely fascinated by that. So even the best and brightest were kind of engaged in this idea that you could take something that's not so and turn it into gold. So this is just an idea that basically these kind of things are not something of the past. Even today, that's true for a lot of important, particularly complex phenomena, this kind of uncertainty. So now I want to say something about what's very difficult to understand if you ever communicate, for example, with one of your relatives about a researcher. The same way how we have a misconception about discovery per se, we'll say, like, for example, if I take it on my own group, I would say, okay, you would say, oh, one of my PhD students, let's say Jeffrey, so he just finished his PhD, he made a discovery in that laboratory. So we normally attach a discovery to a certain person. But is that actually really true? And you all know that we compare researchers. I don't have to go far out of the University of Sheffield or our department, where people say, oh, that's a better researcher than the other one. But is it all that easy actually to think? And here I just do something, because people think that when they talk or somebody made a discovery, they don't necessarily think, oh, okay, yeah, that here we can very pinpoint, obviously he was really the proprietor of the idea, so he did that. That is for certain. It was a one-man group, nobody kind of secretly working. This is an everyday research group. It's actually arbitrary. I took that from a stock photo from the Max Planck Institute, where I did my PhD. This is one of the world leading groups about mass spectrometry. You can start making a head count. That's about like probably 30 people that all work there. The group where I did my PhD was one, is still one of the leading electron microscope groups in the world. We had, at the time when I was there, we were 85 people in one group. With one PI at the top. 85 people. That's kind of as large as the entire department of MBB. Which is a little bit difficult as a PhD student to work under this condition. There's only one person. I had not much contact actually with my boss during my PhD. Not very surprising. He had 84 other people to take care of. So the reason I'm saying that is there is this mythological belief, you know, that a scientific discovery is done by one person, and that of course is given to the group leader. You know, they will talk, oh, this person, this researcher made, and it's often completely ignored that you have, of course, maybe a huge number of these people, and we know historical cases where some of these people, for example, did actually the real discovery, made the discovery. But of course the credit is given a little bit like in old historical medieval times to the kings, to the person who heads the group. And I've encountered cases in my professional life where actively the PIs discouraged the people in the laboratory, stop working on this, is a total waste of your time. And that was at the end the discovery that actually brought a lot of funding into the group and fostered the career of the boss. Is that fair? And here we come for the first time very easily into the question about ethical concern. So who would actually get the credit? The person who conceived probably the general idea, actually Professor Mann is there in the background, that's him, Matthias Mann. Or is that the postdoc who had the idea? And we'll talk a little bit about that in this sense. And these are already, in a different way, ethical process aspects, but I will talk about that too. So keep in mind when we talk about the discovery or when we compare scientists, we often compare apples with oranges actually. And that makes it kind of like a little bit relative if somebody thinks, oh yeah, this is kind of like that person is exempt. That doesn't mean that there are exceptional people, like this fellow here, who does it all alone, but that's of course the exception today. And this group is actually tiny, by the way. You may have, I don't know whether you've ever seen the picture of the CERN, of the Large Hadron Collider group that works there. There's like hundreds of people. The Nobel Prize basically covered only the travel ticket to Stockholm for the group. That was like all used up basically. That's how large that group is. So we have today, particularly in particle physics, we have research groups that count in the hundreds up to thousands and more people. And then becomes, of course, really the question, who did there what? Is really one person deserving the Nobel Prize? Anyway, so that is clean right. So now we come to the assessment of science. Now, as a scientist, the core is you publish. And there are lots of these journals. Actually, it's really difficult to keep track. There are about 28,000 peer-reviewed journals worldwide. And actually, the number is far higher. There are some very odd journals that are called predatory journals that publish stuff against the fee that you pay. So there is a kind of like a side, a gray zone. These, what I'm talking, are accepted peer-reviewed journals. About 2.5 million papers per year. No one can ever read that. And about that is, this increases by by an amount of 4 to 5%. Fun fact, who's the nation in the world that actually publishes the most papers? National, it's not the UK clear. The United States. Who thinks the United States? A large number. You are correct, till about 1.5 years ago. It was one of those events that just happened, tectonic shifts that we are not aware of because they never make it into the evening news. About 1.5 years ago, China surpassed the United States in the total output of scientific papers. In the field where I work, high resolution electron microscope, if you talk with the people who sell these high electron microscope, they will tell you that 75% of their top electron microscope is sold currently to China. There will be a tectonic shift coming in science, and the reason I have good news for some of the Asian people here, if you speak Chinese, we may eventually change and publish in Chinese. You may all think that, oh well, yeah, of course, I mean, we publish in English, yeah? It's a lingua franca of science. But that's recent actually. Before the Second World War, the vast majority of science paper were published in which language? German. German. And the largest number of Nobel Prize winners were in Germany. And that shifted then after the Second World War in part to a number of facts. But that shifted there. But that of course doesn't mean that it will ever stay. You all know that it's quite interesting. So There have been debates about the example that I showed you, Copernicus. Was he a Polish person? Was he German at the time that part was occupied by Germany? And then some people would say, well, you can just look in which language he actually published his scientific things. But any idea in which language he published?
Latin.
Absolutely correct. Everything in Latin. There's not a single scientific report, neither in Polish nor German. So you cannot take a scientific oeuvre to kind of make a decision whether he felt as German or Polish. There was a language franca at the time for scientific discovery, Latin. I still had to actually, before I started studying biology, I had to take Latin classes. That was actually mandatory when I started studying. That has been dropped. And I can tell you, if I stand somewhere in Rome, I have super hard time to decipher a few words on some historical document. So there's a huge number of this. But the question is, of course, how make people actually decisions where to publish? Have you ever wondered yourself? I mean, of course you know that people in the department publish something, and so the question is at random, are you just picking something by the color of the cover? So one of the aspects that people use for that is what's called citations. And the idea behind that is kind of like very convincing. If you publish something, other people cite it, you know, then it means that it's of importance, or totally clear story. Or is it? I'll give you one example of a paper that was published in Nature about hot smokers. These are underwater springs basically that discharge superheated water. They are usually on volcanic ridges. And people made their measurements about and tried to find out what's the maximum temperature where life can actually exist. And that paper found the number, it was actually around 300 degrees Celsius, that later turned out to be a complete misread. So they basically measured the temperature inside the smoker water, but there's actually no life at that temperature possible, as far as we know. But it was published. It was published in Nature. Okay, you would think that this paper is not cited. This paper is actually often cited. At the beginning, in positive way, for the finding, later as a wrong finding. You can get citations for have published at one point something that we call short CRAP. Because people will cite it, of course, they will say, yeah, okay, at one point we saw that's possible, the phenomena, but it has been disproven. And in scholarly way, actually, you would cite that paper. So I'm just saying, so the number of citation doesn't tell you that much, actually, even per journal. It also depends on other factors, like how many scientists are working in the field. So that's kind of like here the citation, basically. And here are some journals in the field of microbiology that's more dear to me, and you will see there are different numbers of citation per journal. But that, of course, doesn't mean that this tells you anything about a single paper published in these journals, because there may be one that's not cited at all, and one that is cited 100 times or higher. Now, some very thinly people have created something that's called the impact factor. So that's basically a quotient between the total number of papers, kind of the total number of citations for any paper in a journal. And it gives you a numerical value that somehow reflects how often things are, of course, cited. Although it doesn't tell you something about an individual article, how often that cited is. So in Nature Science, these top journals, you have a relatively high percentage of papers that are cited overly often. So hundreds of times. But there are also papers in Science and Nature that are barely cited a dozen of times. So just publishing in the journal doesn't tell you anything actually about the number of citations that it gets. Nonetheless, people use it as a surrogate. It's a historical fact that these impact factors were originally actually coined by a company who wanted to convince libraries to buy subscriptions to journal. There is no scientific backing actually for that origin. There was a gimmick, a sales gimmick of Thomson Reuters, a very important information company. You will see that. Now, however, these numbers have real meaning. And that's why they're so worshipped in science. They have real meaning for you if you plan to become a scientist, because the quality of your science is, among other things, measured with these numbers. Numbers give you always the illusion of precision. You know? If your impact is 5.9, that tells you something right kind of gives everybody a feeling. It may be meaningless, actually, because it may only reflect how many scientists are actually working in your community. It may be giving a low thing. However, they are used, among other things, to judge here in the United Kingdom universities. So the research money that the University of Sheffield gets, among other things, from the government is, among other things, dictated by the impact, the total impact of papers. And I had just last week on Friday, I had a meeting with Professor Williams where we went through what Egbert has published. The chicken Egbert, how many eggs it has laid. These are the scientific papers and how good they are in order to support the goal of the University of Impact Factor, these things. So they have real meaning, although there is right now a very important push to actually abandoning this kind of worship of this factor, and this is stated in the so-called Declaration of Research Assessment. I'm just highlighting here, you can read this a little bit, it basically just reflects that research is communicated in many various ways. The journal impact factor was originally invented by Thomson Reuters, as I said, and created as a tool to help librarians identify journals to purchase, not a measure of scientific quality of research at all. But it became that surrogate, and like many things, it just ran off kind of like it became super important for that. So the assessment of science, of course, goes when you publish a paper. And every paper, when you publish it and submit it, you may wonder what then happens. So normally, nothing actually happens. You wait for a few weeks for nothing. But while you wait, this process runs up. You submit your manuscript, it goes to an editorial board of a journal. They look at what it's about, identify a number of reviewers, send it to these reviewers. Each of the reviewers makes a report, writes a report. The report goes back to the editorial board. They make basically a summary of that report and make a decision whether they're either not interested at all or whether there should be some changes done, and this is called the publishing decision. Either it's published often after prolonged back and forth and changes of experiment, or it is rejected, and then often scientists go that they submit it at a different journal and the process goes over. That just gives you a little bit an idea how that is. Now, the financial side of research is important, and so here, when you look at the examples that I told you, they're a little bit skewed because of the historical aspect is that only Stanley Prusiner actually was public funded. He was self-financed, he had also a benefactor. He had a benefactor with his background from a cobbling family. There wasn't much money to support research. Darwin was extremely well funded. And that's the reason why when you look back that a lot of the people, the historical giants of research were actually very privileged people. Often actually, of course, from noble families, because they had excess money and they had excess time. They didn't have to work, so they pursued science as a measure of leisure during their life. Now that's not today any longer. This is the research budget in the United Kingdom, total. So that's about 7.9 billion kind of like money that's spent, pounds, and that splits here up of the European sources. That's the part that basically the United Kingdom will now lose. As following of the Brexit, that's about 11% of the total funding. So some groups will be extremely affected by the lack of that funding source. These are just the research council that give money out. They have usually specific areas, like the BBSRC, for example, is biotechnology. Then what we do, this is the physics council, engineering, physical science. The people in the Higgs building will get their research money from that council. We get it from this one here. Now to get funding, you have to research and submit a research proposal. And that has a fate pretty similar, like actually a paper that you submit. You submit a research proposal, and then the funding agencies picks reviewers. I get often asked to be a reviewer for other people's research funding. Then you write basically a report about that. That again goes into a report that's used as a funding decision, often in a hearing with scientists that are knowledgeable in that field, and they either give you money, yes or no. Then you can perform research, or here you're a little bit in a pickle, because if it's rejected, it's quite different actually. So in the United States, you can take your idea, you can tinker around and improve it and resubmit it. In the UK, that's not possible. It's a one-time shot. You can submit it, and if it's rejected, then you have to write either something completely novel, or about 2/3 of the grant have to be completely different. And if you have only one idea, that's a little bit difficult to handle. So it's actually kind of like is a little bit a very harsh aspects of science. And so, as the last thing for today, I talk very briefly about the gatekeepers of science. So who decides actually what is published? There are 3 gatekeepers of science. The first ones are your peers, that are the other scientists that actually read your kind of research. Now they basically evaluate your research on 2 levels, for funding decisions and your papers that they review and make decision whether they accept it. The drawbacks are that peers may not recognize, for example, truly novel science. We will talk later throughout the course about very important findings that were rejected by all of the peers. And we'll see how important that is. There's also a conflict of interest, you know, and that's a very important aspect to understand about science. Science is not inherently democratic. nicer in the decision. You know, if you all say, well, that's how it is, and I say, oh no, that's differently, and one or the other is right, correct about it, only one person can be correct about it. So it doesn't matter whether the majority, for example, in the room think that if you flap with your arms hard enough, you can fly. That makes it not true. So that's kind of like the first period. The second one are the scientific journals. The scientific journals actually, of course, basically accept things for publication, and so they're kind of like the clearinghouses through their peer review, linked to that up here. However, again, they may not recognize all the science. I don't know whether you've ever heard about you all are familiar about CRISPR. Dave Hornby will talk about CRISPR. CRISPR has the first paper publication about CRISPR was submitted to about 8 different journals and 7 times rejected. They started out in Science in the very top and then went lower and lower and lower and they became more desperate and more desperate to publish at the end. At the end it was like in some ecological journal of an impact factor that was super low. And we're today talking that business is probably $1 billion worth, the idea, and there are whole research institutes that devote themselves. Science is not inherently democratic. If one person has a good idea, they may eventually win out. It's very important to understand. Finally, of course, the funding bodies decide, what's research as a gatekeeper. They give the money. The problem with fundings is that, again, they may not recognize or unexpected novel sciences. They may tell you that's true. Everybody thinks that's rubbish. I talk, if for example, submit a grant about the idea that prions are not the cause of prion diseases, it will not be funded. You don't get the money, you cannot do the research. So you may not be able to actually be in a position to easily disprove a scientific hypothesis. And that's a problem. These funders may have, for example, panels that are certain schools of thought about that, or they have competing interests, for example. They may be interested in one thing or the other one. Anyway, so I stop here. I see you tomorrow, and we start talking about the history of genetics, and I will post the additional information about the timeline. All right, okay. Oh, yeah, no, pleasure. Oh, no, I'm just... Oh, yeah, no, I don't think so. Okay, so if you switch it off at the end, you can get down Oh yeah, no, because I'm no check. Otherwise I would check myself.
I'll lock you up. Don't worry, I'll lock you up.
Okay. No.